Hi, Clara.
Hi, Honor. I'm Clara Bingham. I'm a journalist and author, and more recently, an oral historian. And my most recent book, which comes out July 30th, is called The Movement, which is an oral history narrative of the birth of the women's movement.
I'm Honor Moore. I'm a poet and memoirist, and it turns out editor. And my most recent books are Our Revolution, about my mother and myself, Women's Liberation, Feminist Writings That Inspired a Revolution and Still Can, and my most recent, A Termination, which has no subtitle because I'm tired of subtitles, which is about my pre-Roe 1969 abortion and sort of the birth of myself. The year is 2022, and I imagine this. A woman and her friend drive to an abortion clinic across the border in Mexico. A police car screeching after them. Gangs of men track you down. Flash of the recovery room in New Haven, my abortion. Next thing you know, they'll round up women like me who had abortions in 1969. No statute of limitations. A woman who publishes a book about her long ago abortion is imprisoned when she gives a public reading at a bookstore in Texas where she once read her poems. You think they're lining up for you, but they crowd in and pour accelerant on your stack of books and light a match. I discovered during the last, 10 or 15 years that there was that the younger generation like you and younger often really didn't know what it was like. For us, before the right wing decided on making abortion a wedge issue, that we really, getting out of having a child was like getting out of the draft. I mean, it was something you had to work very hard to achieve, just as the guys of our generation did things like eat beets so their urine would be red so that they could, be diagnosed with some fatal illness. I was in therapy, and I found myself at 23 pregnant. And so I realized that I had made a decision in my own behalf before I had a behalf. I mean, before I had a self, because there was no feminism that I knew about in 1969. I didn't sort of get it until when a friend of mine said, there's this thing in New York called women's liberation. And I was like, oh my God, that's me. And that's when my, life changed. And as Vivian Gornick says somewhere, at that point, the lens through which I looked at my life changed inalterably. The problem lay buried, unspoken for many years in the minds of American women. But on an April morning in 1959, I heard a mother of four having coffee with four other mothers in a suburban development 15 miles from New York say in a tone of quiet desperation, "The problem." And the others knew without words that she was not talking about a problem with her husband or her children or her home. Suddenly, they realized they all shared the same problem, the problem that has no name.
And then the next step happened in 1964 when the Civil Rights Act passed, and Title VII, which was the many titles in the Civil Rights Act, which ended Jim Crow. Title VII was for discrimination in the workplace. And that was the only part of the Civil Rights Act that included women. And the one word sex was added very last minute on the floor of the House of Congress, and it slipped in. And then when the EEOC started the next year, the expectation was that all of the complaints, or a large majority, would be from African American, from people of color, from men of color who were severely discriminated against in the workforce. But it turned out that a third of those complaints came from women. And at about that same time, Pauli Murray, who was, I consider, as important as Betty Friedan as the mother of this movement, of the second wave feminist movement. She was a Black woman and a legal scholar who was also an early civil rights activist. And she was kicked off a bus 15 years before Rosa Parks, when she protested Jim Crow in her native North Carolina. She then went to law school and went to Howard University, which was, of course, all Black. She was one of 3 women in her law school class and was severely discriminated against because she was a woman. And it was a light bulb moment for her when she realized, oh, this isn't just about race, it's also about sex. And she and another amazing lawyer named Mary Eastwood, a white woman who was 20 years younger than Murray, wrote an important legal document, which you have early in the book, called Jane Crow and the Law. And this basically laid out the very important sort of legal construct for how discrimination on both race and sex are very similar. So we have Pauli Murray to thank for starting now with Betty Friedan in 1966, which was the NAACP for women, and helping make that connection between the civil rights struggle for people of color and the women's rights struggle for women.
One day in the New York Times, I read this article about women disrupting the Miss America pageant. And it was like, wow, I still thought it was merely a stunt. And then it was only later from Alix Schulman that I learned the actual details of it. And she was one of the organizers. And she writes in our headnote, on September 7th, 1968, protesters on the boardwalk tossed bras, brooms, and other instruments of female torture into a freedom trash can. Contrary to legend, they burned no bras. Well, inside the convention hall, this I didn't know about, others unfurled a banner from the balcony proclaiming women's liberation, disrupting the pageant, and bringing the fledgling movement international media attention.
So many other people read about that demonstration. So it really got things moving in terms of the numbers of people who were starting to understand that this was for them, just like you. It was sort of a click, as we later called it, you all later called it a click moment of seeing, oh my gosh, I have been living one way, and I need to live another way. Vivian Gornick was a Village Voice writer, which was one of the few newspapers that allowed women to actually write at the time in New York. For me to really understand what it felt like, reading Vivian was the big moment. And you quote her in your book from her amazing November 27, 1969 article called Women's Liberation, the next great moment in history is theirs. She writes, to have instilled in women the belief that their childbearing and housewifely obligations supersede all other needs is to have accomplished an act of trickery, an act which has deprived women of the proper forms of expression necessary to that force of energy alive in every talking creature, an act that has indeed mutilated their natural selves and deprived them of their womanhood. Whatever that may be, deprived them of the right to say I and have it mean something. And so that's what I think is so important about this movement, about people to understand, is that it wasn't about just politics. It was about identity and women being able to be who they needed to be.
There were so many little groups, and everybody, there was no internet. Just remember, no email, no internet, no. So pamphlets, there were pamphlets and leaflets. And one that I remember reading was published by Witch, Women's International Terrorist Conspiracy from Hell. Witch is an all women everything. It's theater, revolution, magic, terror, joy, garlic flowers, spells. It's an awareness that witches and gypsies were the original guerrillas and resistance fighters against oppression, particularly the oppression of women, down through the ages. Witches have always been women who dared to be groovy, courageous, aggressive, intelligent, nonconformist, explorative, curious, independent, sexually liberated, revolutionary.
They dressed up in black hats and had hilarious actions. The witches went to Wall Street and they glued the doors shut of the stock exchange at 3 a.m. Do you remember reading one of the great manifestos, Women Identified Women?
Yes, I absolutely do. Women's liberation was not only about those kinds of actions. It was also a sea change in our relationships with each other, because a commitment to a woman was just as important as, romance with a man, if not more important. The most profound articulation of it is in this piece called Woman Identified Woman, which was collectively written by radical lesbians, another coven. It is the primacy of women relating to women, of women creating a new consciousness of and with each other, which is at the heart of women's liberation and the basis for the cultural revolution. Together, we must find, reinforce, and validate our authentic selves. As we do this, we confirm in each other that struggling, incipient sense of pride and strength. The divisive barriers begin to melt. We feel this growing solidarity with our sisters. We see ourselves as prime, find our centers inside of ourselves.
One of the other pieces that you quote, which I wanted to talk about because it was also a big part of my book, was Frances Beale. And she wrote a manifesto called Double Jeopardy. And it was about being Black and female. And she made the first sort of manifesto that we now would call intersectionality. I wanted to interview Fran Beale and talk to her about the process of writing this great manifesto. But she was quite elderly and not responding to any of my emails. And I traveled out to San Francisco, where she was from. Anyway, Linda Berman, I asked her, have you been in contact with Fran Beale? Can you help me find her? And she picked up the phone and called Fran, who was at in her, not a nursing home, but an elder care community in the outskirts of Oakland. I brought with me, because your book had just come out relatively recently, a copy of your book, in which, of course, you have Double Jeopardy. And I gave it to her, and she was there in her room, very cheery, incredibly alert intellectually. And so this was the first time she saw it, and she read Double Jeopardy out loud to me.
Oh my God.
It was such a moment. And we talked about the process that she went through of writing this, which also came out of her consciousness raising group of Black women at SNCC. And then she would just, mimeograph it, which is what everyone did pre-Xerox, and try to give it away or sell it at radical bookstores. And then Robin Morgan approached her, because Robin Morgan, who was part of Witch, decided that there were so many of these pamphlets and manifestos that she was getting bursitis, because she had big bags of them that she would carry to campuses giving talks about feminism and what this is. And so she went to her consciousness raising group and she asked different women to write different chapters chapters. And then she found Frances Beale and said, can I please publish Double Jeopardy? And in 1970, her book Sisterhood is Powerful came out. And so that's when Double Jeopardy reached larger audiences for the first time.
The cover of Sisterhood is Powerful is a red fist within a red circle, and that was an image of a button that I believe Robin designed or had the idea for. And the slogan, Sisterhood is Powerful, we all had these buttons that we would wear. I mean, it was the era of buttons, so there were many buttons, but that was like the one.
There was a collision course going on between the sexual revolution and also the counterculture, which, was a piece with sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And so there was this new freedom that was being experienced by your generation, basically, and everyone was allowed to have premarital sex for the first time. Though abortion was illegal and there was no birth control, which meant that women were saddled with this major problem. It became a health crisis. There were wards in city hospitals, like at Cook County and in Harlem Hospital, that were just for botched abortions. Fran Beale was one of them. And she told me the story of her abortion in Harlem on a kitchen table. And she was bleeding out. She went straight to the Harlem hospital where they interrogated her and wanted to know who her abortionist was, because it was obvious what had happened. She would not reveal his name because I think he was a young medical student. And because he would have been arrested and probably jailed. So there were so many of these just hair-raising, horrible stories that people were witnessing everywhere.
I was a woman with enough privilege that I could go to a psychiatrist and pay for an abortion in a hospital. But that didn't, I was told I couldn't tell anyone. Heather Booth, she started this sort of collective of women, and they would put up a little sign saying, pregnant, in trouble, call Jane. And Jane was actually a collective of women who guided women to safe abortions. You interviewed some of them.
Yes, I did. I interviewed Heather Booth at length, who is one of the great organizers of the movement then, and still is, actually. And I interviewed Marjorie Tabankin, who is also an activist now and she was a student at the University of Wisconsin. And a girl came up to her and said, I'm pregnant, I'm young, I really need help. And Marjorie had heard of the Janes, and she called Heather Booth, having no idea who Heather was. Heather used, of course, this fake name for secrecy. And Heather helped her. They had to raise money and bus the young student up to Chicago. Heather arranged for the abortion. And after that, so many people by word of mouth knew it. And so Heather got her consciousness raising group in Chicago, which was very active. And they started a big, big organization. They had a doctor who performed a lot of those abortions. The mafia at the time was involved, and they would get doctors to give them kickbacks. And it turned out this doctor wasn't a doctor, and they thought he was. When they discovered he wasn't a doctor, he also was getting chased by the mafia. He disappeared. Before that, he trained the women. And so many of them performed the abortions themselves. And it was, they rented apartments all over Chicago. Sometimes they would use their own houses. They had lots of subterfuge and ways of driving people to, unknown areas, but they were very humane, and they would explain to these women exactly what was happening to them so that they didn't have to have a scary experience being blindfolded and knowing that maybe their lives were at risk. They were part of what became a women, not just an abortion rights movement, but a women's health movement. I actually wanted to ask you, Honor, what you thought when you first saw your first copy of Our Bodies, Ourselves.
First of all, just the idea, just like Woman Identified Woman, the title of the book said it all. Oh, my body is part of myself.
The Bread and Roses, which was the Boston women's liberation sort of umbrella group, held a conference at Emmanuel College, which the nuns there had no idea what was about to hit them. It was very fun. And one of the many agenda items was Our Bodies, Ourselves. And some of the founders of this later book gave a talk on women's anatomy and sexuality and birth control. And it was so popular that they then they went to MIT, where some of them were faculty wives at MIT, because of course women were not in the faculty of almost any college at the time. And they took over a conference room on a regular basis, and people came in droves to this class that they talk on women's anatomy. And one of my favorite stories, I interviewed several of the founders, was when they drew a large vagina on the chalkboard. And so many women didn't even know what the clitoris was, and they didn't know anything about the vulva, and it was so shocking. And men were trying to get in. They barred the door so no one could see this sight. But it was really the beginning of women understanding about their anatomy, because it's important to remember all of the doctors were men. The women in Our Bodies, Ourselves, in this group of Bread and Roses, then went off that summer. Each wrote a different chapter about different parts of women's health. They put it together. It was published by an underground radical press called the New England Free Press, and then sent out to radical bookstores, groups, very cheaply was the point. And they, of course, sent it to all the Janes. So it was always stacked up on their table. And then later, Simon & Schuster realized this is selling thousands and thousands of copies. We want a piece of the action. So Simon & Schuster, my publisher, published the first mainstream version of this book, and it went viral. It's now been in 8 different editions and hundreds of languages, and it's such an important book and such an important part of the movement. We are back to 14 states radically limiting abortion. The past is roaring into the present.
Abortion is not only it's not only an operation, a medical procedure. It is an act of self.
This is such a good time to remind readers how far we've come and how important it is that we don't go back.